What's good, everybody? I'm Jędrek, and today I want to talk to you about how I approach the Hammer Time matchup, which is one of the most popular decks right now in Modern, with Grixis Lurrus. This video will be first of the series in which I will approach a different popular matchups in Modern with Grixis Lurrus. First off, it will be obviously Hammer Time. Then in the coming weeks, I'm planning on doing a similar videos for Murktide, for Elementals, maybe for the Mirror Match, and maybe for some other decks that will emerge as more popular additions to the format. So the the basic structure of these videos will be that first I will go over the plan that I have in the matchup, as I think it's vital to have a well-constructed plan in any given matchup. And I think Hammer is the perfect first deck to cover because A, it's a very popular deck right now, and B, it has a very clear plan or Grixis has a very clear plan on how to approach the game against Hammer, and I can show you what I mean by having a plan and so forth very easily. Then I will talk a bit about how I sideboard in the matchup and stuff like this, but those things are less important once you figure out the plan, because it will all come naturally. If you know what's the plan in the matchup, then you will figure out how to sideboard on your own, because it just takes a, I don't know, minute or two of actually thinking about how you win the game to devise a proper sideboard plan quite easily. So without any further ado, let's just jump right into how I usually win against Hammer Time. Alright, so if you've been following my content or Magic content of any sort for a while now, you know how much I care about having a plan. And it's been something that people have been writing about in Magic basically since the dawn of the game. There is probably the most popular article ever of Magic literature, which is called Who's the Beatdown? And it very well illustrates how you should approach any given matchup. The cards in the article might be a bit outdated since it's from the 90s, but the underlying philosophy of it's still up to date, and it's still very important. So go read it if you haven't for some reason yet, and let's move on to Hammer. So the simplest way to describe a plan against Hammer is that your ultimate goal is to set up Lurrus with engineered explosives against them to lock them out. It's a very simple and very clean win condition because they can't interact with it very well usually, and once you get there, once you can just EE every turn, is very hard to lose the game. So how to get there? If you reverse engineer it, how do you get from, okay, I keep my hand and I play my first land, my first spell, and so forth, to I have Lurrus with explosives in the play. So before you get Lurrus and explosives, usually always you have to put Lurrus into your hand and play Lurrus. Sometimes you will play Lurrus without explosives, and you have to stall till the explosives with stuff like Lurrus and Seal of Removal, Lurrus and with Seal of Fire, Lurrus with Snapcaster Mage, or with Mishra's Bubble to just draw cards, or with Dress Down post board. But the ultimate goal is to set up Lurrus with explosives, and that's a very good way to stall out. How would you how do you even get Lurrus into play? So obviously you have to clear the board, and I think it's pretty important to thread this balance between knowing when you need to put Lurrus into your hand ASAP, against which kinds of draws you have to put it into your hand ASAP, or if you can afford to wait a bit. And for example, if your opponent has Urza's Saga, or even worse, multiple Urza's Sagas going, and you don't have a good clean answer, like you already have E, or you have Colagan's Command, or Unholy Hit with Stampcaster Mage, or something like this, then your priority should be to put Lurrus into your hand as soon as possible, because they will just outgrind you. And there is this misconception that in Hammer is just a deck akin to like Boggles or Infect, and it's a very fragile aggro deck. The truth is that Hammer can grind very well thanks to cards like Esper Sentinel, cards like Ludus, obviously, Pure Steel, Stoneforge Mystic. Urza's Saga, their deck is just packed of 2-for-1s, just like Grixis is. And neutralize their 2-for-1s is very important. For example, if you can, and you usually can, you should pay 1 mana to kill Esper Sentinel or pay additional mana to kill it without them drawing a card. You should kill Pure Steel Paladin before they can get a chance to draw, and stuff like this. And if they don't have this multiple Urza Sagas draw, you can just usually chill out a bit, trade 1-for-1, and then put Lurrus into your hand when you have a spare 3 mana and their board is clear. That's why Seal of Removal and Seal of Fire are so good against Hammer, because you can just put it on the board on turn 1 or turn 2. You can have this 0 mana interaction on board, and then on turn 3 you can just very aggressively put Lurrus into your hand if they only have like, I don't know, 1 creature. If they have a creature and Sigarda's 8, either Seal will kill the creature once they want to go in with the hammer. Sometimes they will have 2 hammers and you will lose with Seal of Fire, but with Seal of Removal you can always go around that, which is very important. And you can even log them out with Lurrus as soon as like turn 5. I think turn 5 was the earliest I went. Like I went E on 0 on 1 on first turn, then blow up E on 2, put Lurrus into my hand on 3, then on 4 you can do some stuff, on 5 you play Lurrus with E on 0 from the graveyard and you're just good to go. Or even on turn 4, if you played Seal on turn 1, you can play on turn 4 Lurrus plus Seal, and it's you are already furthering your advantage this way. So I covered how do you win, but how do they win? How does Hammer win against you? So obviously they have their best starts. Sometimes you will die on turn 2, which is very, very rare in the matchup, I think, because of the abundance of interaction in Grixis deck. So sometimes they will kill you very quickly, but it's not very common. Usually they will either grind you with Urza's Saga if you draw a wrong half of your deck, or not enough somewhat permanent answers to Saga like Seal or EE. And the second one is Pure Steel, just re-equipping stuff, grinding you out. So those 2 cards, Saga and Pure Steel, are definitely the ones that you should be concerned about the most game 1. And you should save your removal spell for Pure Steel. You should always have a plan on how to combat Urza's Saga. And then post-board, they also have Sanctifier Anvek, which is a card that is pretty, maybe not easy, but it's not very hard to beat once you are prepared for it, and once you have a proper tools to deal with it, which this deck does. For example, if they have Sanctifier in play, you obviously have E on 2 to deal with it. You have Dress Down plays Lightning Bolt or any other removal spells. You can ambush them with Snapcaster Mage, or you can just take the beating from it for a couple of turns unless they have Hammer on it. And in general, it's okay to take a bunch of damage, either a couple of turns of just them chipping away on your life total, or them attacking you once with Hammer for like 10, 11, 12. If it's not like upwards of 15, then it's probably okay. To kill the more priority targets, like for example, if they attack you with a Memnite with Hammer and you have Terminate and Bolt, it's okay to wait to see if they play something important in the second main phase. Then you kill this, and then you can kill Mem Knight. And yeah, it's basically it. It's basically that you can afford, as in many aggro matchups, to take the match to prevent them from gaining significant card advantage. Similarly, you should save your discard spells once you are like turn 3, turn 4, because they can either put Lurrus into their hand, and then you have a prime target for Inquisition, or they can play Steel Shaper's Gift or Stoneforge Mystic and put Hammer into their hand, and they will wait till they draw Pure Steel Paladin or Sigarda's Aid with the Hammer. So you can snag it in. Okay, so aside from obviously winning the game, Hammer can also interact with your luck, so to speak, or your victory condition. And the most common interaction that they have is Pithing Needle on explosives. So they basically always play Pithing Needle either in the main deck or in the sideboard. If you go to Goldfish, it will tell you that roughly 40%, I believe, people place Pithing Needle in the main deck, but it's always there post-board. So you have to adjust, and you have to save your Colligans command, for example, to kill Pithing Needle. With 4 Snapcaster Mages and 3 Colligans commands, it's pretty easy to have one when you need it, but you have to be aware of it and not just spew it to, like, I don't know, kill a Mem Knight and discard them a card or something like this. The other big way that they can interact with you is a removal spell for Lurrus, which is luckily pretty rare, because if they start having too much Path to Exiles in their deck, their draws will become too reactive, and you can basically beat removal spells if they give you enough time, because you can take Lurrus, then you can Inquisition, then snap Inquisition, and you can take their paths, and it's not the best way to combat Lurrus. I've played against a bunch of people with a red splash, and they've had a Pyrite Spellbomb under the Saga, which was pretty problematic. They caught me off guard in one of those games, and I lost because they spellbombed my Lurrus, and I wasn't aware of the fact that they could have this kind of answer. So I guess the most important part to notice from this is that they usually don't have a direct way to deal with Lurrus under the Saga, so they can't tutor it up. But they can tutor up the Graveyard Hate, which breaks the Lurrus EE combination. It's one shot, so because they are playing either Soul Guide Lantern if in the main deck, or Tormod Script in the sideboard usually, they pretty rarely play like Relic of Progenitus, and it's somewhat easy to play around. And right now I'm gonna get into how you can do so. So, as I've mentioned previously, especially in the sideboard games, you should save your K command for either Pithing Needle or Graveyard Hate, instead of just spewing it early into the game. Also, you should not crack Bubble or EE immediately if you don't need the effect, since they can tutor up or draw Graveyard Hate. So, for example, if you have 2 Mishra's Bubbles in the graveyard and you play Lurrus, you play one of them from the graveyard, you shouldn't crack it unless you really need a card until their end step, so you can have one and play one in the graveyard in case they draw a Tormod Script or this sort of effects. So even if they exile the one in their graveyard, in your graveyard, you can still sack the other one and replay it. Similarly with explosives, if you happen to draw 2 explosives, try to not have both of them in the graveyard at the same time. Okay. Other tips that I think, or tips, other things that are in my opinion important to cover is to know what saga targets they have, because Urza Saga is obviously the cornerstone of their deck, and you have to be aware what they can tutor up with it. So obviously there are targets that they will play 100% of the time in the main deck, which are stuff like Hammer, Shadow Spear, Memnite, Ornithopter, Springleaf Jam. Basically those 5 cards, they will always have them in the main deck, always in 4-offs, aside from Springleaf Jam is sometimes a 3-off, so is Memnite, but they will have, and obviously Shadow Spear is a 1-off, but they will have those cards in their deck at all times. Then there is Piffing Needle, which is almost always in the 75, usually in the sideboard, but it's not uncommon to have one in the main deck. Then they're also playing Paradise Mantle, which is a card that sometimes is in the main deck, but not always. Soul Guide Lantern, sometimes in the main deck, and rarely in the sideboard. If they have a sideboard Grave Hate, it's Torma Script most of the time. And most lists that does not have main deck Soul Guide Lantern will have sideboard Torma Script. Welding Jar, sometimes in the 75, usually in the main deck. Expedition Map, which is rarely in the main deck and basically never in the sideboard. And finally Mishra's Bubble, which is sometimes, I would say, even rarely in the main deck. So basically that's how I would present the plan against Hammer Time. And I'm gonna see you in a moment talking about how to use this knowledge to sideboard properly against them. Alright, so when it comes to sideboarding, I think most people will have issues with a more control builds of Grixis, not a creature builds of Grixis, because it's pretty obvious that creatures are not very good against Hammer because they don't further your game plan in any meaningful way. So, okay, Darcy will sometimes surveil some important cards, but it's still not worth a piece of cardboard in the matchup. So if you are playing creatures, you will just usually cut all of your 1-drop creatures, and you have around 6 or 7 cards in your board that you can possibly bring against them. It's more complicated with a creature-less version, or 1-drop-less version to be more precise, because seemingly all of your cards are good against them, or vast majority of your cards are good against them. So I think the biggest stepping stone for me was when I realized that you can, and you should, in my opinion, trim Expressive Iteration against Hammer. Because if you look at Expressive Iteration, it's a main phase 2-mana investment with no impact on the board that can very easily backfire on you if you don't get a good iteration. A bad iteration can basically lose you a match against them. And often you can't afford to iterate till turn 5 because you want to have already 4 lands in play to cast your interaction or blow up your explosives or whatever with the leftover 2 mana if you have a bad iteration hits. And it's somewhat common to flood on them if you have 4 copies. Also, because your end game of Lurrus with explosives is so effective against them and they have not much counterplay against them, you just can cut some of your card advantage because you don't need to. You just need to grind a bit better than they are, or better than they are, not vastly better like you would with 4 iterations. Same thing with Cling to Dust. It can be useful, obviously they are playing Lurrus after all, but Cling to Dust is a pretty embarrassing card against Sanctifier on Vec, so you should just cut it. Also, once again, you don't need more value in the matchup, and gaining like 3 life off of it, it's not very relevant. Then, in the control version, if you still need some cards to board out, because you have a lot of bangers in the sideboard, I would definitely look towards Inquisition of Kozilek and Counterspell, because both of their cards are not playing to the board. Inquisition is better because it's both cheaper and you can play it proactively after they get Lurrus into their hand, so you don't need to hold up mana for it like you have for Counterspell. both of those cards are pretty okay versus Hammer still, but once again, if you have better cards in your sideboard, then you can trim a copy or 2 copies of either of them. Once again, usually counter spells before Inquisition. You still have Drown in the Look, because I think that if you have 0 counter spells against Hammer, they can exploit it pretty easily once they learn about it, because they can just jam their value threads without any considerations for your interaction on the stack. So with only drowns, you are still good on this angle. So feel free to trim some counter spells post board. Which brings me to good cards that you might trim the bad cards for, because you have so many of them. I mean, so many good cards. Basically, anything that deals with their cardboard efficiently is okay, and anything that makes it easier for you to go to your endgame. So, of course, every single copy of Engineered Explosives will be in. I will not play less than 3 copies of explosives in the list. In the whole 75, as long as Hammer is one of the most popular decks. Those days I'm on 1 main deck 2 sideboard instead of 2 sideboard 2 main deck 1 sideboard. So the split is this split of 1-2 instead of 2-1 is mostly caused by the metagame getting a bit more open once more. The last challenge was won by Eldraditron that split the finals with Greentron, so people are getting a bit more out there. The metagame is less about just Hammer versus Murktide. So I just made some changes to the deck to be a bit more well-rounded, but still, every single explosives you have in your deck should be in post-board. Same goes for Dress Down. Dress Down is a very good card against Hammer. It's surprisingly versatile card in general, but against Hammer, two main uses of Dress Downs are obviously killing the Urza Saga's token, because they will just be 0/0s and they will die immediately. So you can kill 2 tokens for 2 mana and then cantrip as well, which is pretty good. You can also just use Dress Down as a pseudo Misha's Bubble with Lurrus of the Dream, then, because you can just replay it every turn. If you replay Dress Down with Lurrus, usually it's better to replay it in your own end step. So if you're playing on Modo, have a stop in your end step. If you are playing in paper, instead of saying pass the turn, then say something like I would like to go into my end step, stuff like that. It's obvious, you know that. So if you play it in your end step, then it will stay alive on the return. So for example, if they play Sanctifier on Vec when you have Dress Down, it won't exile your red or black cards that you already have in the graveyard, which is usually pretty annoying. And then you can just bolt it or terminate it. And then, so I already kinda weighed in on the second use of Dress Down, which is to deal with Sanctifier on Vec. Ideally, you would play it in response to Sanctifiers, so the aforementioned ETB trigger of exiling your stuff won't happen. And then you can just tag it with any removal spell. You can also Dress Down in response to Esper Sentinel, so you don't have to pay the tax, to Lurrus so they can't replay, to Paladin so they can't equip for 0, to Stormforge Mystic so they can't search. Basically, every creature in their deck, aside from Memnite and Ornithopter, is at least a bit influenced by Dress Down. Same goes for Ingenious Smith, which is somewhat popular in those decks. So you deny the ETB trigger. You can even Dress Down Inkmoth Nexus, so they can't infect you with 1 hammer. Okay, and as far as other sideboard cards, Alpine Moon, obviously great one. Usually goes for Saga, but also from time to time you want to, if you have Dress Down, which already covers Saga pretty well, and they have multiple Nexus or Nexi, I think. You can just Alpine Moon Inkmoth Nexus. You can also reset your Alpine Moon with explosives later on. So, for example, you have Alpine Moon on Saga, and they are started drawing Nexus. You already have explosives to cover tokens. So you can just EE on one, kill their one drops and your Alpine Moon, and then redeploy Alpine Moon on Inkmoth Nexus. And also any kind of disenchant naturalized type effects is very good against them. So Werther, Nature's Claim, I don't know, Shattering Spree, Vandal Blast, what have you. I would have all of them in. Okay, that's basically it. That's all I wanted to say about Hammer. I think the matchup is much easier once you understand how to approach it. It's a pretty skill-intensive matchup, and if you don't have a clear plan against them, you can find yourself losing somewhat often to them. But overall, if you follow those steps, I think you will emerge victorious more often than not. In the last showcase, I've played against Hammer 3 times. I've won 3 of those matchups. And the week before, I've played Hammer twice. I won once and lost once. And the difference, of course, the quality of my draws, but also because I spent this week on figuring out all those stuff and how I would approach the matchup in the coming weeks. And it paid off. So I was pretty glad. And yeah, as I've said before, next following weeks will focus on different decks, Murktide, maybe Mirror, Elemental, stuff like this. And until then, as usual, I stream on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday from about 1 or 2 p.m. European. The link is in the description. Alongside other socials like Patreon, like Twitter. So yeah, I hope this video will prove useful to you. I wish you a lovely weekend, and as always, happy Lurrusing. Take care.